Well, hello everybody. My name is Corwin, and I'm going to be talking today about America's love affair with guns and the history of how we got to where we are today. But first, we need to do a couple of ground rule things. We actually need to have a safe space here, a place or an environment in which a person or category of people can feel confident that they will not be exposed to discrimination, criticism, harassment, or any other kind of emotional or physical harm. Now, this safe space has to be extended to either side of the political spectrum, right or left. That's just fair. So, having said that, let's continue. So let's be really honest here. One of the biggest reasons that you might be watching this video is because of current events. And, well, to put it bluntly, current events are awful. People's emotions are running extremely high, and there's lots of calls to repeal the Second Amendment, and there's lots of calls to have more guns. So let's try to set those aside for a second, and let's try to understand how this all came about to begin with. If we're going to look at the historical precedent, and understand the history of how we got to this crazy place that we're in, we need to look at the American Revolution. And one of the big arguments was that, well, in the American Revolution, the only thing people had was muskets. And since that's what was in use when the Constitution was written, and that no one could have foreseen how deadly our weapons would be, that's what Americans should be restricted to having. Okay? If we're going to follow that logic, let's do it. Let's look at the facts, look specifically at what weapon or weapons that were in use and how they compared to military firearms of the time. Interesting note here, if people are not interested in learning anything and they just want to rage against the other side, right or left, this is usually where they have no interest in going further. It's almost like they're allergic to facts. The first weapon that I want to examine is the one that the government was using. Now, at this time, the government was the British government. And this weapon right here, commonly referred to by its nickname, Brown Bess, was the standard issue military firearm to the British Army. All of the infantry was basically issued this weapon. Now, despite the fact that we might want to call this a rifle, it is not, okay? When this gun was invented, the word rifle hadn't even been invented yet, okay? It has what's called a smooth bore. Basically, the inside of the gun barrel is smooth. Not a very original name, but very accurate. The thing about this gun is that it's very easy to manufacture, especially in the couple hundred years leading up to the American Revolution. And its accuracy is not something that can be determined in decimal places because the skill of the shooter and the amount of wind that you have and the ambient temperature of the air, no joke, actually does all play factors. So I'm going to generalize this as a weapon that you could not hit someone on purpose at 100 yards, unless you had a whole bunch of people lined up, all shooting at another bunch of people all lined up. And when you look at the wars in that era and how they were all lined up shooting at each other, and you're thinking, wow, that's really stupid, okay? The reason they did that was because the guns that they were using, like this one, Brown Bess, wasn't any more accurate, and like I said, you really couldn't hit anything on purpose at 100 yards with this gun. Okay, now, the weapon that a lot of the rebels, and of course we won the war, so we call them patriots, but a lot of the weapons that the American fighters were using were very much like Brown Bess. Depending on who you talk to, about 50% of the weapons that they were using, in particular the legendary Minutemen, were these weapons. This is called the Kentucky long rifle. Unless you're from Pennsylvania, in which case it's called the Pennsylvania long rifle. So I want to throw that in there so I don't get a lot of, nasty messages from folks up in PA. But anyway, you had the long rifle here. Now, this is a rifle, okay? This is not a musket. Now, let's talk about the word rifle. Rifling is a word that did not originally apply to a gun of any kind. That's what you called the gun, okay? Rifling was spiral grooves on the inside of the barrel of the gun, which made the projectile spin, which greatly increased accuracy, and a whole lot of other things. It had a lot of benefits. This was so revolutionary that basically all small arms in the world are based on its design, okay? Very few exceptions. Even smoothbore shotguns also have a lot of shells that have rifling on the shells themselves. So this was a major breakthrough. Now, it's pretty easy to visualize how this was such a breakthrough. If you're familiar with football, when the quarterback throws the ball in a spiral, he does it so it travels further and more accurately. The same principle basically applies here with a bullet. So really pretty simple. The thing about the Kentucky long rifle is that it was also faster to reload because it had fewer steps, because you had fewer components that you had to stuff down the barrel to make it accurate. Okay, so the advantage of the Kentucky long rifle was this: it had a faster rate of fire, it had significantly better accuracy, and much better stopping power because of the spiral grooves. This weapon, in every way, was superior to the standard military issue rifle of the British Army. And that's why every small arm manufactured today is based on the Kentucky long rifle, particularly the spiral grooves, and they are not based on Brown Bess. Now, to illustrate how important the Kentucky long rifle was, in that it was so much superior to the muskets that were general issue to the British Army, all we have to do is look at the Battle of Bunker Hill. This was a very key, pivotal moment in the American Revolution because you had a fairly large force on each side, roughly about 3,000 people on each side. The numbers vary depending on which historian you talk to. Most people agree that the British had a few hundred more. But here's the thing. What we want to do is we want to look at the casualties, but not only that, we want to look at the types of casualties. And what I'm specifically saying is I want to see if that increased accuracy and the superiority of the Kentucky long rifle compared to the standard military issue long gun of the British actually played a factor. And I think it's going to be pretty easy to see and answer that question. Now, the first and probably the most important thing to see here is that the number of troops involved on both sides was relatively equal. Okay, the Loyalists, the British, had about 3,000 men, and the Patriots had a few hundred less. Now, there are lots of other factors involved here. I'll just mention them briefly. Patriots were dug in and had a good fortified position on the hill. Okay. The British were charging up the hill. Not ideal. But here's the other factor. The British were fielding a professional army that had trained together extensively. The Patriots were not. They were collected from all walks of life, and they were not professional soldiers. History has dictated that unless something else goes on, the professional army always wins. Just ask Alexander the Great. That's one of the things that made him so invincible. He was using a professional army. But here's the number that really strikes you right in the forehead. The British took twice as many losses as the Patriots did. Okay? They lost a lot of soldiers. And when you have a professional army, even if the non-professional army has a much better position, you don't see numbers like this. But the really harrowing bad number for the British is this. The British lost an insanely high number of officers. Now, in this type of warfare, or previously to this type of warfare, officers wore different uniforms. They had shinier uniforms, and they usually did not carry a long gun, they carried a sword. Now, this goes back to the idea of that before the Kentucky long rifle came around, you really couldn't hit anything on purpose at 100 yards, but now you could. And here you can see it. They lost over 80 officers in a troop of 3,000 men. Now, in an infantry type situation, the ratio of officers to soldiers does vary, and it can vary quite a bit, but they lost probably the vast majority of all of the officers on the field. General Howe, who was commanding the British forces, would later go on to admit that his entire officer staff had been wiped out at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and that the cost of victory was too high. So you tell me, if we go back in time and we actually look at the comparison between what the American Patriots were using and what the standard issue weapon for the Army was, is that a comparison that favors the Second Amendment right advocates? Or is that really a comparison that, well, you get the idea. So I'll let you decide what conclusions to draw from this. I think there are only two possible conclusions if you strictly go by historical records. One would be that either the military is restricted to muzzle loaders that are smoothbore, or, well, you finish the sentence.